Chapter 7. Confident that difficult people are no problem for God. This is not one of my favorite subjects. To me, it's easy. Difficult people should just stop being difficult. Unless, of course, you and I are the difficult ones. Then, well, may God show us our sin and turn our hearts back to Him. The book of Daniel begins with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being taken in the first wave of captives from Judah to serve in King Nebuchadnezzar's court in Babylon. They were given new names, put through a rigorous educational and training period, and had to defend their desire to eat according to their Jewish customs instead of eating the food dedicated to idols. By the second chapter of Daniel, we get a glimpse into the kind of person King Nebuchadnezzar was. He had a dream, and rather than tell his wise men the dream, he insisted the wise men tell him the dream and its interpretation because he feared the wise men would simply make up an explanation to sound good. When they told him it was impossible, Nebuchadnezzar ordered they all be put to death. Sounds like a difficult person to me. Maybe there was an abundance of wise men in Babylon at that time. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar figured he'd be better on his own or heard one too many lousy interpretations. At any rate, that's how an executioner ended up on Daniel's doorstep. I'm not sure how I would have responded to an executioner showing up at my house, but Daniel struck up a conversation. Once he knew the situation, he asked to be taken to the king to ask for time. The king granted his request, and Daniel and his friends began praying to know the dream and its interpretation. The book of Daniel teaches many lessons, not the least of which is to turn to God when you have an impossible person in your life. You may never have to deal with someone determining what food you can eat or if you will live or die, but people can make your life pretty miserable just the same. And all too often, it's not a situation you can walk away from. If that person is part of your family, you may have to deal with them at holidays or special events. Moving might not be an option when a new neighbor buys the house next door. And what do you do when you love your job, but your boss retires and the new guy is not your biggest fan? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego couldn't leave Babylon, and it's not like they had rights as captives. They were stuck dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. Even after Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar about the dream, the king's newfound awe of Daniel's God didn't last long. This is not a surprise to anyone who has prayed for an unbelieving friend or family member for any amount of time. They get sick, you pray. God heals them. Things go back to status quo until the next crisis when you pray, God shows up, and you point out God's gracious answer to prayer. Repeat. Thank God for his patience. Soon after the dream incident, Nebuchadnezzar set up a huge golden statue, gathered all his administrators and employees, and ordered them to bow down and worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused, and Nebuchadnezzar had them thrown into a furnace hot enough to kill the soldiers who threw them in. God spared their lives and even sent an angel who appeared with them in the furnace. When they came out, their clothes were intact. Their hair wasn't singed. They didn't even smell like smoke. Surely that made an impression on Nebuchadnezzar. But reading the next three chapters of the book of Daniel is a reminder that Daniel would serve pagan leaders the rest of his days and would often find himself as the odd man out. Following God is a lot like that a lot of times. Sometimes you are the only Christian in your workplace. Some people become Christians after they marry and suddenly find themselves in a difficult position with someone who doesn't believe the way they do. There's plenty of struggle even in Christian homes with addiction, mental health, physical health, old age, with children who stray. All too often, these things cause the people you do life with to be less than fun to be around. What can you do in those situations? When Daniel and his friends came to a new challenge, they got creative. They sought an exemption with the diet and were willing to undergo a short term trial to prove it would work. When the executioner came knocking on Daniel's door, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He convinced the executioner it would be worth it to take him to the king. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given an ultimatum to bow down to the statue or be thrown into the furnace, they clearly but respectfully stated their allegiance to God. all those things point to the fruit of a mature spiritual walk with God. To remain calm in the storms, to be kind even when confronted by a hothead, and to state fearlessly that following God is worth more than life itself are not automatic behaviors, but behaviors that are refined through Bible study and prayer. But there's another lesson too important to miss. Daniel had a healthy dependency on prayer as a means of communicating his needs to God. After the executioner took him to see the king, then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. In Daniel chapter 6, after a different king made an edict that anyone who prayed to anyone but him for 30 days would be thrown into a lion's den, it says, now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. Verses 10 and 11. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel saw a vision of a man. He said, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up trembling. Then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. Verses 11 and 12. Daniel, according to the man, set his mind to gain understanding, humbled himself before God, and prayed. If you are in a struggle right now with a difficult person, this seems like a pretty good game plan for coping. God, help me to understand where this person's negativity is coming from. Is there unresolved hurt or shame? God, I don't understand and I don't have answers, but I know you see and understand all things. Show me what to do, when to speak, and when to listen. Help me. I've studied the book of Esther more than a few times, and Esther had to deal with some difficult people too. The first thing to note when reading this book are the characteristics of King Xerxes. In the opening chapter, he had a 6-month party to show off his wealth. He summoned his wife to the banquet, where alcohol was abundant, in order that he might show off her beauty to a group of men. And when she refused, he relieved her of her position as queen. I don't know about you, but that doesn't put Xerxes in line for husband of the year in my book. But then again, I've never been in charge of an empire with that kind of power at my disposal. My impression of him only gets worse as he goes along with his advisor's plan to bring all the beautiful young virgins of the land to his harem and give them beauty treatments for a year before being taken to the king. The note in my NIV study Bible says, Esther also was taken. Neither she nor Mordecai would have had any choice in the matter. The EHV Study Bible says something quite different. It states Esther is among the candidates who are auditioned for the position of queen. The text does not state whether she volunteered or was drafted. She seems to be a willing participant in the sorted process, but according to Herodotus, many unwilling women were forced into Xerxes' net. Esther may have been one of them. At any rate, Esther agrees to hide her faith. In this regard, she is in stark contrast to Daniel and his friends. This is one of the reasons some readers were uncomfortable with the book of Esther. Be that as it may, the Lord will make use of Esther's secrecy to undo Haman. As much as I have enjoyed my EHV Bible, I abhor the word audition used in this context for a few reasons. First, the fact that Mordecai determined and Esther obeyed him in terms of keeping her Jewish identity a secret does not, in my opinion, make her a willing participant. It makes her what Jesus called shrewd as a snake, Matthew 10, verse 16. By that, I mean she hid in plain sight, blended in, kept her head down, and didn't make waves, but mostly I abhor it because of what comes next. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. Esther 2, verses 13 and 14. The indication is that the virgin did not return as a virgin. I wouldn't call what transpired an audition in any circumstance. Esther may not have protested, but that doesn't mean she agreed with what took place. She may not have had the courage of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol, but that, in my opinion, does not equate to acquiescence. It may simply mean that Mordecai and Esther knew Xerxes' character and knew he was not a man to mess with. Any noncompliance on her part would likely have resulted in death, and rather than go that route, she chose to comply. In the book of 2 Kings, we see a similar situation. A man named Haman who had leprosy came from Aram to see God's prophet Elisha to be healed. Elisha gave Naaman directions to wash in the Jordan River. When he did, Naaman was healed of leprosy. Once he was healed, Naaman confessed, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." 2 Kings 5, verse 15. Naaman understood that this newfound faith would put him in a difficult position when he returned home, so he said to Elisha, "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. 2 Kings 5, verses 18 and 19. Naaman no longer wanted to kneel before another god. He now knew the true God who had healed him. Naaman asked to be forgiven for bowing with his master, and Elisha granted him freedom of conscience. Many women in China were forced to have abortions during the time when each family was allowed to have only one child. It was not their idea, nor did they feel as if they had a choice. Would God have provided miraculously if a woman had a child secretly? Possibly he would have, but that would have meant she would have had to hide her pregnancy and quite possibly give birth outside of a hospital. Where would the child go to school? Could she hide said child for life? Many women didn't see that as an option. God will hold the leaders of China responsible for the blood of those children. Is it easy to pretend that you would make a different decision if in that situation? Maybe you would. Sin is never the preferred option, but God's mercy forgives even the sins you commit when you aren't courageous enough to stand up to do what is right because you cower. Would Esther have rather had the traditional Jewish marriage? Did she and Mordecai willingly go along with Xerxes' plan with the hopes that she would become queen? I can't answer either of those questions. I can't imagine wanting to be married to Xerxes, knowing what she knew. But that too is not a sentiment I can make with any certainty. Soon after Esther's marriage, Mordecai uncovered a plot to assassinate Xerxes, told Esther, and saved Xerxes' life. Xerxes made a man named Haman his right hand man, and for whatever reason, Mordecai was not a fan of Haman. Mordecai alone refused to bow to Haman. Again, the Bible doesn't give context, only facts. The king ordered that everyone bow to Haman, and Mordecai refused. In retaliation, Haman sought not only to destroy Mordecai, but every Jew. And somehow, in a conversation that lasted less than most sitcoms, Haman convinced Xerxes to go along with his plan. The fate of the Jews was set, and the proclamation was sent out. If the first chapters of the book of Esther show Xerxes to be arrogant, extravagant, prone to rash decisions, and an excessive drinker, this turn of events doesn't do much to color his character in a positive light. Esther's reaction when called upon to approach him for help shows their relationship wasn't like marriages today. She knew the law, and the law was that she couldn't go to him unless called. She had not been called in a month. Add to that the fact that Haman was also arrogant, rash, power hungry, and influential with Xerxes, and Esther had her hands full. The book of Esther shows that difficult, rash, powerful, arrogant, influential people are no trouble for God. In perhaps the most entertaining turn of events in the Bible, Haman met his demise even as he plotted to bring down Mordecai. Christians don't need to fret when seemingly the wrong person comes into a position of authority or a place to influence their lives negatively. They don't need to go about wringing their hands or complaining to whoever will listen. Proverbs 21, verse 1 states, "In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him." If God can direct the heart of a king, he certainly can change the heart of your spouse or neighbor or whoever makes your life difficult. When we were married, my husband Steve and I moved into a house that shared a driveway with another house. A beautiful elderly couple owned the other house. They taught us everything about being good neighbors. When our water heater needed to be replaced, the gentleman taught Steve to do it. When our birthdays or anniversary came around, they were at our door with cookies and a card. For many, many years, our children wandered over to the quote unquote old folks' house, as our neighbors like to call it, to check in with and entertain them. As the years passed, the gentleman began caring for his wife who struggled with dementia. As his caretaking duties increased, so did his irritability. He suddenly started finding everything our children did annoying. Every time I saw him walking down the driveway, my heart sank because I knew he had another complaint. Early on, Steve and I decided we would love him no matter what. I'd thank him for letting me know about the latest complaint, and I'd give him a hug. More than once, when I hugged the man, tears fell from his eyes. God was the only one who could give us the strength to return his complaints with loving kindness. By doing so, our relationship was kept intact, and that led to a time when I would take care of him in the last year of his life. Jesus told us to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5, verse 44. He went on to say there would be a reward. You can't begin to know what the reward is at the time, but there will be a reward. Sometimes it is the reward of a relationship. Sometimes it is seeing someone come to faith. For Esther and Mordecai, it was the deliverance of their people. If you were to question if Mordecai's stubbornness was the catalyst for causing the situation and raise the possibility of his being somewhat difficult, you may not be entirely wrong. If only we knew the whole story. We don't. We know what God allows us to know. But that possibility leads us back to the way I began this chapter. Sometimes you and I are the difficult ones. We may think we are right or justify what we do, but we can't neglect the Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 to 3. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. We do a lot of damage. In fact, we use God's name in vain when we act selfishly or abusively or hard-hearted towards others while professing to be Christians. Doing so tarnishes God's good name and may keep people from wanting to be Christians. We don't love perfectly all the time, but it's certainly worth considering and asking God and the people around us how we can improve our disposition if this is our struggle. God doesn't expect us to do this on our own or by our own strength. God will strengthen us and help us, Isaiah 41, verse 10, especially when we ask Him to do so. When my son was 15, he asked me if I had anything positive to say to him. That statement changed my parenting. I didn't realize until that moment that most of my communication sounded like this. Did you shut the garage door? Put your shoes away. Make sure to. I started trying to catch my kids doing something praiseworthy, I tried to remember to thank them. I slowly and deliberately started building them up with my words instead of complaining or reminding them of something they didn't do. I'm still working on it 7 years later, but I'm a whole lot better than I was, and I'm committed to being better, not just with my children, but in general. I don't think most of us want to be difficult. A whole lot of times we don't realize that we are. But are we encouraging? Are we grateful? Are we kind? God forgives us every time we mess up. With His help and the strength He provides, we can do better. It's amazing how relationships change when we are.